There are moments in history when a leader says something that doesn't just echo through microphones, but through markets, through communities, through the hearts of people watching, uncertain, tired, and deeply aware that a turning point may be at hand. This is one of those moments. The call to end the Israel-Iran war isn't just about silencing weapons. It's about choosing a future that isn't dictated by vengeance or ideology, but by resilience and reason. This isn't a headline, it's a decision that ripples through oil prices, cybersecurity readiness, global alliances, and the mental health of entire generations who are growing up knowing nothing but tension. The world tends to view ceasefires as pauses in momentum, as temporary silences in an otherwise noisy history, but that thinking is outdated and, frankly, dangerous. A ceasefire, when initiated with foresight and strategy, is not an act of weakness. It's one of the strongest moves a leader or a nation can make. It signals not surrender, but the ability to think beyond the moment, beyond the headlines, and into the hard math of what comes next. It is the kind of decision that understands that continuing to escalate doesn't always lead to resolution. It often leads to collapse, in ways that ripple far beyond the immediate battlefield. When conflicts spiral, people assume the most powerful position is to double down. More pressure, more force, more retaliation, but true strength, measurable strength, is the capacity to choose sustainability over spectacle. It's not just about winning today, it's about ensuring there is a tomorrow worth living in. Choosing to call for a ceasefire means investing in long-term results over short-term applause. It means recognizing that progress doesn't thrive in rubble or through revenge cycles. It requires the maturity to accept that every war, even the ones fought in the name of justice, has diminishing returns over time, and eventually, even the strongest actor becomes a victim of the instability they helped perpetuate. This is not theoretical. There are decades of data spanning every continent showing that protracted conflict weakens every key metric that keeps nations healthy: economic output, innovation, education, environmental stability, and public health. We've seen what happens when conflict zones become the norm rather than the exception. Infrastructure crumbles, brain drain accelerates, inflation soars, and the region becomes a case study in how not to grow. What a ceasefire does, when handled responsibly, is buy time to reset, not to retreat, but to recalibrate. It enables leaders to rethink strategies not from a position of desperation, but from one of design. And design is crucial. You can't rebuild anything, let alone a peaceful future, without space to think, communicate, and act deliberately. In a conflict zone where every second is a countdown and every decision is urgent, there's no room to plan wisely. A ceasefire isn't about creating a lull, it's about creating bandwidth. Bandwidth to re-engage allies, to re-evaluate goals, to see if the narrative can shift from victory to viability. Because victory without viability is a hollow win. And eventually, the cost of maintaining that illusion bankrupts even the strongest powers. Strategic strength means understanding timing, not just tactics. There is a moment in every prolonged standoff when the smartest option is not escalation, but pause. And the nations or leaders who recognize that moment before it becomes obvious are the ones who lead the world forward. They don't wait for consensus, they build it. They don't chase validation, they define it. They use the ceasefire not as an end point, but as a pivot toward a bigger vision. Let's also be clear. Calling for a ceasefire doesn't mean ignoring accountability. It doesn't mean abandoning your values or compromising on justice. In fact, it's often the only way to create the conditions necessary to pursue accountability meaningfully. True justice isn't delivered during war. It's crafted in the clarity that comes after, when the noise dims and the systems of truth can function. The most effective accountability mechanisms require cooperation, visibility, and structure, all of which are impossible in the fog of constant retaliation. There's also an opportunity here. A ceasefire isn't just about stopping violence, it's about restoring potential. It's about giving societies a chance to redirect their talent, their energy, and their resources back towards solving real problems. Poverty, climate change, food insecurity, disease prevention. These are the battles worth fighting, and they require the same focus, funding, and leadership that war consumes. So when a leader calls for peace, not out of weakness, but with a strategic mind and a steady hand, it should be understood for what it really is, a power move. It's a decision rooted in metrics, foresight, and moral intelligence. It's the kind of move that might not dominate the evening news with explosions, but will define the next decade with impact. The challenge isn't in choosing to stop. The challenge is in being strong enough to stop first, to be the one who sees beyond the horizon and acts before it's too late. That is not the easy choice, but it is the right one, and it will always be the most powerful one. Accountability without diplomacy is noise, and diplomacy without accountability is fiction. The world doesn't need more noise, and it certainly doesn't benefit from fiction. What we need, what actually moves nations forward, is the ability to hold both principles at once. This isn't a contradiction, it's a skill, and it's one that must be learned, applied, and prioritized, especially in moments when tension runs high and the impulse to choose sides outweighs the discipline to create solutions. Holding a nation accountable for its actions, whether it's for launching attacks, sponsoring proxies, or violating international norms, is necessary, not out of vengeance or moral superiority, but because the absence of accountability breeds chaos. Systems only work when they're respected, laws only matter when they're enforced, and peace is only sustainable when it's built on trust, not on fear or silence. But accountability alone doesn't rebuild broken regions or de-escalate long-standing hostility. For that, you need diplomacy, the very thing that makes communication possible in the aftermath of conflict, the tool that doesn't erase history but offers the architecture to move beyond it. Diplomacy is not about ignoring truth. It's about working with it. It's a structured approach to building pathways out of dead ends. It doesn't say, forget what happened. It says, now that it has happened, how do we prevent it from happening again? This requires sitting across the table from people you disagree with, people whose actions may be indefensible, but whose participation is necessary if we want to build something better than an endless loop of retaliation. One of the challenges in today's environment is that too often, diplomacy is viewed as softness, as if talking signals submission or engagement signals weakness. But look at any long-term success in global conflict resolution, and you'll find that diplomacy was not a luxury. It was the bridge. Strong diplomacy creates structure. It defines consequences. It applies pressure strategically, not emotionally. It doesn't let violators off the hook. It gives them a visible path back to responsibility, with clear steps and clear boundaries. If we remove diplomacy from the equation, what are we left with? Isolation, resentment, escalation, and these aren't abstract consequences. They're real-world outcomes with measurable costs: disrupted trade routes, strained alliances, radicalized populations, weaponized economies. In contrast, when diplomacy is fused with accountability, outcomes shift. Sanctions become targeted instead of blunt. Ceasefires become stepping stones, not stalling tactics. Negotiations produce timelines, verification, and impact instead of stalling behind slogans and standoffs. This kind of balance doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design. It takes leaders who understand that you don't preserve strength by shouting louder, but by thinking longer. It requires recognizing that justice and stability aren't competing goals. They're complementary ones. We need institutions and actors that can enforce consequences while simultaneously drafting the agreements that prevent further deterioration. That's not compromise. That's engineering peace with precision. There's another layer to this. Accountability must be based on evidence, not emotion, and diplomacy must be based on structure, not sentiment. The moment we allow popular opinion or ideological fervor to replace facts and frameworks, we lose the integrity of both concepts. Responsible actors must resist the temptation to turn every crisis into a performance. The work of peacebuilding is often slow, quiet, and unglamorous, but it's the only work that leads to a future not shaped by repeated mistakes. It's possible to hold a regime accountable while still engaging with it. That duality may seem uncomfortable, but it's essential, because exclusion rarely changes behavior. It just hardens it, and unchecked aggression doesn't stop aggression. It invites it. It's easy to condemn, it's harder to connect, but progress only happens when we do the hard things first. We must redefine strength, not as the ability to dominate a rival, but as the maturity to lead them toward a different path. Not every opponent will cooperate, not every outreach will succeed, but refusing to try ensures the failure of everyone involved. At some point, someone has to step forward and say, "We can pursue justice and still keep a door open. We can be firm and still be flexible. We can demand accountability and still speak the language of diplomacy." Because both are needed and neither should be left behind. In today's world, complexity is the rule, not the exception. And the solutions that will define the next era will come from those who don't run from that complexity, but who stand in the middle of it and design something that actually works. Geopolitical conflict doesn't confine itself to maps. It doesn't stay within borders or respect the idea of distance. It seeps into systems, it delays innovation, it destabilizes trust, and ultimately it slows down the very progress the modern world depends on to move forward. The assumption that a war happening over there is only relevant to those within reach of its bombs is a fundamental misunderstanding of how tightly connected everything now is, from data to networks to trade routes, from energy markets to humanitarian frameworks. When a conflict begins, it's not just lives at risk its momentum. Supply chains fracture, international collaboration stalls, scientific research that relies on global partnerships slows down. Tech infrastructure, which should be scaling to deliver better education or health care, is instead redirected or paused entirely. Progress is not just about great ideas, it's about timing, stability, and the freedom to build without the constant fear of collapse. Imagine a region that was on the verge of a clean energy breakthrough, suddenly turning that focus to military defense, or a population that was just beginning to lift itself out of poverty, now displaced and dependent on aid. These shifts aren't dramatic headlines. They're silent losses that the world only tallies up years later when the missed opportunities become painfully obvious. Every war diverts capital, not just financial, but human capital. The engineers become soldiers, the teachers become refugees, the researchers go silent, and the world collectively takes a step backward, even if it doesn't realize it at the time. There's also the matter of attention. The world only has so much bandwidth. When global focus zeroes in on a crisis, other essential issues fade into the background, health initiatives lose momentum, climate goals are delayed, digital equity programs become underfunded. Conflict monopolizes the conversation, and in doing so, it delays the resolution of other critical challenges. The longer a conflict lasts, the longer the pause button stays pressed on everything else that matters. Then comes the economic impact. War inflates commodity prices, distorts markets, and drives up uncertainty. Investors hesitate. Innovation funding dries up. Entrepreneurs, especially in developing economies, are the first to feel the squeeze. Startups that could have transformed industries don't get built. Solutions that could have scaled stay stuck on whiteboards. The cost of war is not only measured in destruction, but in the dreams that never make it past prototype. Technology suffers too, not because we stop innovating, but because we innovate in the wrong direction. Resources that could have gone to clean water systems or advanced diagnostics instead go to surveillance tools or autonomous weapons. That's not advancement, that's adaptation to crisis. And while some of those tools may find secondary uses, their primary purpose reflects a world that is prioritizing defense over development. And in education, the impact is generational. Conflict zones produce disrupted childhoods, learning halts, curriculums vanish. A child who misses 3 years of schooling doesn't just fall behind. They often never recover that lost time. Multiply that across thousands of communities, and the long-term impact becomes staggering. These aren't just children. They're future doctors, engineers, civic leaders. When they're caught in cycles of violence, the global talent pool shrinks, not metaphorically, literally. What's often ignored is that conflict also erodes trust between nations, between institutions, between people. And trust is the foundation of progress. It's what allows countries to share data, businesses to partner across borders, and researchers to publish freely. When trust collapses, cooperation collapses with it. And without cooperation, the pace of progress slows to a crawl. Even the digital world isn't immune. Cyber conflict escalates alongside physical conflict. Infrastructure becomes a target. Misinformation floods the system. Online collaboration becomes riskier. The openness that allowed the internet to become a tool for collective problem solving starts to fracture, replaced by silos, restrictions, and fear. It's tempting to view geopolitical conflict as a matter for politicians and generals. But that view is incomplete. It's a matter for scientists, entrepreneurs, students, and everyone who's trying to build something better. Because conflict tears at the very fabric that holds all these efforts together. The cost isn't only in bombs or sanctions, it's in the thousands of quiet decisions not to innovate, not to invest, not to try, because the risk seems too great. Progress demands stability. And while that doesn't mean we'll ever live in a world without disagreement or tension, it does mean we need to be relentlessly focused on minimizing the chaos that prevents real solutions from taking shape. The future doesn't wait, and if we want to meet it prepared, we can't afford to be distracted by fires we could have prevented, or at the very least extinguished faster. Leadership isn't about echoing what's already loud. It's not about confirming what people want to hear or amplifying what's already burning. Leadership means walking directly into discomfort, into complexity, into the spaces where truth is not easy, popular, or immediate. The hardest truths are the ones people avoid because they threaten illusions. But progress doesn't come from preserving illusions. It comes from dismantling them, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. Facing hard truths requires a kind of clarity that resists the temptation to perform. That clarity doesn't always win applause in the moment. Often, it leads to criticism, misunderstanding, or even backlash. But over time, that clarity becomes the foundation for decisions that age well, that withstand scrutiny, and that actually move systems forward. True leaders don't wait for consensus to acknowledge what's broken. They name it early, they study its root, and they act even when the crowd hasn't caught up yet. It's easy to stir people up. Fear, anger, outrage. These are powerful tools in the short term. They rally attention, mobilize energy, and can even generate momentum. But they rarely produce sustainable outcomes. What they do instead is build dependency on noise, on division, on reaction. The moment that momentum is needed to solve something complex, like stabilizing a region, reforming a system, or coordinating global action, it vanishes. Because solving real problems requires more than emotion, it requires thought, patience, strategy, and truth. Hard truths come in many forms. They come in data that challenges our assumptions, in outcomes that contradict our intentions, in voices we'd rather ignore because they complicate the narrative we're trying to promote. But leadership doesn't mean simplifying reality until it's comfortable. It means holding complexity long enough to find what's actionable inside it. There's always a path forward, but it usually starts with letting go of easy answers. In moments of crisis, the demand for certainty becomes louder than the call for accuracy. People want instant solutions, instant villains, instant wins. But real leadership resists that pressure. It acknowledges that some issues won't be resolved in one cycle, one term, or one conference, and it makes that clear, not to discourage action, but to build a longer runway for change. Because anything that matters will take time, and time requires trust. Fueling hard truths is different than facing them. Fueling them often means using them as weapons, selectively. It means taking a piece of truth and using it to justify inaction or division. But real leadership doesn't weaponize truth. It applies it. It uses facts not as armor, but as instruments of insight. It uses truth not to win arguments, but to design better outcomes. There's also a personal cost to honest leadership. It requires letting go of ego, of the need to always be right, of the urge to protect legacy over progress. Many leaders stumble not because they lack intelligence, but because they avoid accountability. They surround themselves with comfort, insulate themselves from dissent, and over time, lose the ability to see what's actually happening. That's not leadership. That's control disguised as command. The leaders who truly change things are the ones who ask harder questions of themselves than they do of anyone else. They admit what's not working, even when they built it. They share power. They invite critique. Not because it's pleasant, but because it's necessary. When systems are built to avoid hard truths, they decay. When they are built to confront them, they evolve. The impact of leadership is rarely felt in real time. It's measured in what doesn't collapse, in what remains standing after storms pass, in the problems that didn't escalate because someone was willing to act early, honestly, and without needing credit. That's the mark of someone who leads for the future, not the spotlight. We need more people in positions of influence who understand that facing hard truths is not an act of risk it's the job. The alternative is to continue designing policies, products, and partnerships around fiction. And fiction, when scaled, always leads to failure. Leadership is not about having all the answers. It's about building environments where the right answers can emerge. That starts with a willingness to name what's real, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, because the only thing more dangerous than facing a hard truth is pretending it doesn't exist. Peace isn't something you declare once and expect to maintain. It's not a slogan for a rally or a tagline for diplomacy. It's an investment, a long-term, often invisible process that demands patience, structure, and commitment. And like any serious investment, peace must be funded, nurtured, measured, and protected. Otherwise, it's just a word we say when it's convenient, not a condition we build toward. In real terms, peace means functional schools instead of training camps. It means healthcare facilities that aren't overwhelmed by casualties. It means access to clean water, stable power, and local economies that can employ youth before they are recruited by extremists. It means data being used to predict social unrest, not just military threats. These are not theoretical ideas. They are specific, measurable, and deeply practical, but they don't happen on their own. Peace happens when societies prioritize these outcomes not only after war, but before it starts. The problem is, peace isn't dramatic. It's not as visible as a missile or as loud as a battlefield. It doesn't trend. But it's the infrastructure that makes every other kind of progress possible. You can't run a startup under aerial bombardment. You can't learn quantum mechanics while fleeing from conflict. You can't solve food insecurity while crops are burning. Every breakthrough we hope to achieve, climate solutions, disease eradication, AI for good, depends on a world stable enough to deploy and sustain those solutions. The real tragedy is that investing in peace is not even that expensive, at least not compared to the cost of conflict. The financial burden of rebuilding after war, managing refugee crises, stabilizing economies, and resecuring regions is exponentially higher than what it takes to prevent those breakdowns in the first place. But prevention doesn't get credit. It doesn't look heroic, and so it often gets left out of budgets and policy briefings. That's not a funding problem. It's a mindset problem. It's tempting to see peace as something leaders achieve through negotiation or treaties. But real peace is built on systems, education systems, public health systems, digital systems that connect rather than isolate, systems that reduce the friction between groups and increase the incentives to collaborate. When these systems fail, conflict emerges not as a surprise, but as a consequence. And when they work, peace doesn't just happen, it compounds. Sustainable peace also requires inclusion. You can't build peace around the table if half the population is kept outside the room. Women, youth, marginalized communities, these aren't side participants in peace building. They are essential. Their perspectives identify cracks early. Their involvement creates legitimacy. Their leadership makes agreements more likely to hold. If peace feels imposed rather than owned, it never lasts. If it's designed with participation and transparency, it becomes resilient. There's also a role for technology. Peace isn't just about politics. It's about tools. Platforms that fight disinformation instead of fueling it. Algorithms that elevate solutions, not outrage. Data systems that help identify at-risk regions before they ignite. These are peace tools too, and they must be funded and scaled like any other innovation. Just as we've invested in technology to fight disease or map climate risk, we must now invest in tools to forecast and prevent human conflict. But even the best tools and systems can't do it alone. Peace needs leadership of a different kind. Not the kind that talks about strength only in military terms, but the kind that understands strength as foresight, that sees a rising tension and responds not with rhetoric, but with structure, that doesn't wait for violence before acting, but intervenes when there's still time to pivot. This kind of leadership often goes unnoticed, but it's the kind that actually shifts trajectories. Peace also needs a public that understands what's at stake. It requires education that doesn't just teach history as a list of wars, but as a map of avoidable mistakes and future choices. It requires civic engagement that values prevention over retribution, that rewards the leader who solves a crisis before it erupts, not just the one who manages it after the damage is done. The truth is, we know how to build peace. The frameworks exist, the models work, the outcomes are proven. What's missing isn't knowledge, it's will, and that will must be grounded in the recognition that peace is not free, but it is worth every resource we can put behind it. Not someday today, because peace isn't a pause between wars, it's the platform where everything else stands. If we treat it as an afterthought, we'll always be rebuilding, but if we treat it as the priority it deserves to be, we might finally have the future we keep promising. So here's the choice: keep reacting, or start rebuilding, keep blaming, or start designing a peace that can scale. The tools are here, the networks exist, the moment is now, because standing with strength doesn't mean standing forever in conflict. It means standing for something greater,